Yeah, can everyone hear me? Okay, great. Zach, this is I mean, reading this, I kind of felt like this is the paper of the future. There's a lot of really cool data, and you're doing things that just a couple of years ago would have been unthinkable. And I think this paper has a lot of promise, as does this entire research agenda. Um, but I think partly because everything you're doing is so new, there are some potential concerns that a potential reviewer might have. Apart from the length of the paper, and I think I tried pasting it all into Microsoft Word to get a word count, and we clocked it over 20,000 words. So at some point, you're going to need to cut this thing in half. Um, but but reading the paper as it currently stands, I have a few points on theory, measurement, and data, mostly on the latter two issues. So on the theoretical side, um, I think there's a key difference here between elite coordination not working because they tried and failed to coordinate, and elite coordination failing because they didn't try. And I mean, and these are two very different conceptual questions, right? And finding that elite coordination didn't work in one case doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't work in general. And I wasn't really sure which of these you're picking up in your analysis, because, and this kind of bleeds over to the empirical side a bit, but the elite coordination interaction variable that you have in the equation for, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that was calculated post aggregation, after you already aggregated up to the country level. And part of the problem with that is that that variable might be high because there's either a lot of elites in that country, or because there's a lot of coordination in that country, but not necessarily because both are happening at once. So I'm wondering if you also looked at, on the tweet level, if I guess your highly influential, high follower Twitter users are, to what extent do they actually try to coordinate? Because otherwise, I mean, it's not clear if your result is like something along the lines of like we lost the war because we didn't invade. But that's one of the problems that might occur here. So do they fail because they tried and failed, or do they fail because they didn't try? Um, and as regards to the data, so you have two very cool media-based data sets that, I mean, so, and this might be a broader question for the group, but on G Delta in particular, about a year ago, this stuff was pretty toxic, right? There was the lawsuit that Kalev had, and there was a lot of talk that, like, if I as a reviewer see an article submitted that uses G Delta, I will immediately reject it. I think that's unfair, but I wanted to, like, to what extent has that kind of died down, and is it okay to proceed with research on this? Because it is a very unique and potentially useful resource. But my broader problem with using tweets to predict G-delta events is that what a lot of Twitter users tweet about is news stories, things they read in the media. I mean, some of them might be retweeting things that they see in the press, or might be linking to it, and you have measures for that. Some of them might just have read something in the news and basically say, oh, though, I mean, there are protests happening right now. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're coordinating, but basically I mean, my broader problem here is that how confident are you that your result isn't just that you're picking up a correlation between social media reports of protests and traditional print media reports of protests? So I'm a Twitter user. I read about a protest that's happening outside my window. Then the same news stories that I just read end up in GDELT and are used to code protest events within GDELT. Um, and you have a few robustness checks on GDELT at the end of the paper that kind of try to get at this. I got to admit to you, I wasn't totally convinced that they totally take care of this issue, that basically Twitter users and GDELT are reporting the same events. Um, now, as regards to your correlation measure, I think the Gini coefficient makes sense. I mean, and I mean, in and of itself, it's related to a lot of ranking algorithms that are used in the informational retrieval literature. But what I wonder is, so Gini coefficient is a good measure of how dominant a hashtag is on a given country in a given day. Why is that a good measure of coordination? So, um, I mean, people might be tweeting a lot of the hashtag Tahrir because that's what's happening. That's the most important event that's happening in their country in that given day. But how does this relate to your kind of conceptual definitions of coordination as, you know, explicit and implicit coordination, things that are more closely mapped onto the literature in this area? Because it certainly captures the importance of a tweet in a given day, but that doesn't necessarily mean, you know, bring tires to the square so we can burn them, or we're meeting there at noon. So I guess this is another way of saying that I personally would be more comfortable with the SVM measure that you say you constructed. Unfortunately, I didn't read the supplemental appendix, so I don't know what goes into that, how you take care of basically where your codebook is, intercode reliability issues and the like, which you would have to defend if you were to go that route. And this is not to say get rid of the Gini coefficient as a measure. It's say probably report both more extensively than you currently do. And this is also particularly an issue for multiple day protests, right? Because if you have kind of a protest spell that goes over multiple days, and people tweet about it on day T-1, don't be surprised if then the same event is picked up in G delta on day T+1, right? These are issues on the okay. So elite measure. This is so you basically measure eliteness by number of Twitter followers. To what extent does that correspond to, I guess, Quran's conception of revolutionary leaders? How do we know that it's not Justin Bieber, right? Or some other pop celebrity? And again, to what extent do these people actually try to play an active role in the protests? And then the final issue, relatively minor, geocoded tweets, as I understand, are only a very small proportion of overall tweets. You say you do not need to have a smartphone to use Twitter, but you do need, presumably, to have a smartphone to enable the location tracking. And beyond that, is the distribution of Twitter users who turn on the geolocation tracking different in any way from those who do not? Are they kind of drawn from the same population? I guess it can go either way. I mean, on one hand, if they can afford a smartphone, they're probably richer than the median user who does not have geolocation software. But then again, I always wonder if you're going to participate in a risky behavior like going out in a protest in an autocracy, why the heck would you turn on your location tracking? But anyway, those are my points. I'll turn it over to the panel. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Yuri. Zach, give a chance to respond. And reminder to anyone, one or two.
Okay, so I'm unmuted. I'm good, right?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. Yeah, Yuri, those are really great comments, and I will make sure to integrate them in the next draft of the paper. I'll keep my comments short since we're just starting. I think the easiest way to understand a lot of your comments is that it's the trade-off between breadth versus depth. I can't do an SVM for 16 countries because I don't have the money, time, or Arabic knowledge, and so that's why it's not the main measure of coordination. Engaging on GDELT some more, I can talk more about that later, but that's again a desire to go for breadth of data as opposed to really getting noiseless data, let's say. For the geocoded tweets, I should be more clear about this in the paper. They are not all tweets with GPS coordinates. I started off doing that, and you just have too few tweets in any of the countries in the study. So they're GPS coordinates plus self-reported location. which is just look at all the tweets in the data set and then see the user's self-reported location, compare that to a dictionary of city and country names, and see which of those are from one of the 16 countries. And that's how we really get most of the location. That introduces a further restriction, which is that we can't connect these events at a finer level than the country level, right? We only know that we only assume someone is in a country, not that they're in Cairo or Alexandria or Tunis, etc. The other points I thought are all spot on and fair, and I can expand more in the paper, so I won't talk about that right now. Let's see where the conversation goes.
Okay, great. I've got Thomas and then Carrie on 2 fingers, and Laura. Thomas?
Sorry, you guys can hear me? All right, so one, agree with Yuri. This is a really fascinating paper and a very careful use of data, and I think it's obviously an important topic. My big question goes to Yuri on theory, and it's a mixture of theory and data. So it's tricky to figure out sort of how many Twitter users there are in a given country at a given time, but I wonder if kind of the framing of the paper is this being kind of an elite versus a coordination phenomenon. I know you say you define elite a little differently, but the best I could find was like the Arab Social Media Report was the closest thing I could find on how many Twitter users are in a given country. And we're talking about 0.035% of the population that was on Twitter at this time. So I wonder, that's already kind of a very small subset, right, of the population. And I wonder if, really what you're picking up on is, hey, we found, political elites who are on Twitter in these countries, right? And we don't find any further stratification within this kind of already highly involved, highly motivated 0.035% of the population. So I wonder if, one, this gets back to the idea about, you arguing that Twitter is the perfect medium here. And I understand the data difficulties, but there are a lot more people that were on Facebook, and a lot of the arguments in Egypt were about Facebook being a coordination device. So I wonder, right, if there's a way to get around that without, directly getting Facebook data. And then the second thing is the idea of sort of what's this picking up related to like media. I think what Yuri was talking about, GDELT, being correlated with Twitter. I guess my bigger, thought was that one of the things that you talk a little bit about in the paper, and you find that the mainstream media effect is pretty strong on Twitter. And again, so I wonder, if what we're picking up is not sort of a causal thing, but just people tweeting what they see, right? And a lot of people see protests going on, so they're going to be tweeting that. And it's not that the Twitter is the coordination device, but rather that it's just kind of recapitulating what is on the news media. So those are my 2 kind of questions in theory, and I think, to improve on those, I think if you can, show that Twitter is picking up something that's different, that's fundamentally different than other mediums, so than blogs or other things, that's, I think, to really kind of make your argument, that's what you need to show. And I think, there are ways to kind of go about doing it, but, that's my main concern or sort of question with the paper as it currently stands.
Okay, great. Zach?
Okay. Yeah, so you're right about the Arab Social Media Report and penetration, which is that it's much lower than Facebook, and tends to be, elites broadly defined. I hadn't thought about whether that means I am picking up elite coordination, and then within this subset of elites, you don't have differentiation. You still have, within the Twitter sphere, there are still Twitter elites in the sample and non-elite Twitter users. And that might not mean that the non-elite Twitter users are non-elites offline. I'll have to look at that more. I do have another chapter where I do a more ethnographic study of very particular users who are activists, some who have very many followers and some who don't. And so I'll think about that more in that context. In terms of whether it's recapitulating what's on the news media, there's certainly some of that going on, without doubt. People retweeting an image of a New York Times article or a photo that they see outside or a link to a New York Times article, and I can control for some of that in my controls for links and retweets, and the controls for the newspapers. But I don't think it's if that is truly what is the only thing that is driving it, then the lag dependent variable should capture all of that. Because I lag all my variables by 1 day, if I'm tweeting what the New York Times or Al Jazeera says today about the protest today, that shouldn't have an effect on the next day's protest. That's gonna that won't show up in the data set the way I've structured the model. But short, I mean, other than that, I can't think of better ways of controlling for this statistically. I can tell you from having read the tweets that you see the vast majority of tweets are not sharing news reports. They're certainly talking about a lot of what the news reports are talking about, but it's not direct engagement with these news sources.
I would encourage you to add something about that to the paper, Zach. Carrie.
Good morning.
Hi,
Am I good? So I had a two-finger on this issue of elite, how you're defining elites, and I worry about two things. First of all, I actually take the opposite view of some of the folks in that I think that that elites is too broadly defined. According to this, it means that one out of every 20 tweeters is an elite. When you're taking the top 5%. And that seems pretty common when I think about political elites and activists. I think more of, 1 in every 100, someone who really mobilizes folks. And so I wonder if your results still hold, if you go up to maybe the top 1%, top 0.5% of Twitter followers when, or people with Twitter followers, and if those results still hold. The second is what Zuri said on kind of selection issues about geolocating. That part, that really troubled me because in really strong regimes that are not likely to allow protests in the first place, it seems to me that you're just not going to geolocate. So it looks like you have no tweets, especially perhaps among your elites who are under surveillance, who the regime is keeping a close eye on. And so why on earth would a political elite tell the regime where they are when a particularly strong regime like, I don't know, Bahrain or somewhere like that is gonna keep a pretty close eye on that. So just two thoughts that I had on that particular issue.
Okay, great. Zach.
Okay, still unmuted. Great. So elites could be too broadly defined. So I try to account for that a couple of ways. First, in one of my earlier tables, I compare table 1 on page 13. I compare the elite 5% measure to Lotan et al.'s actual hand coding of Twitter accounts. And the short takeaway of that is that it kind of varies per country whether the level of influence at the 5% or 3% or 1% level matches what you see from mainstream media accounts or mainstream media employees or bloggers, etc. So that on its own, that percentage measure could be noisy because it seems to vary per country. So then in figure 5 on page 21, I did actually exactly what you suggested, which is to rerun each model with 20 different rankings. And so figure A shows when I use the top 1% measure, like you just suggested, and then all the way down to the top 20%. The only reason I should go finer than even the top percent, I should do like the top 0.5, top 0.1. That's how I set up the code at the time, and I haven't gone back because it takes a couple hours to run. That's all.
Right. Yeah. The way I'm looking at it, like the significance actually increases substantially when you get into the top 1%. If I'm reading that graph correctly on page 21.
Yeah, it is just that significance, and so I should explore that end of the distribution more. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of the distribution, the table 1, the thing that I noticed there is that your average versus your median of like followers suggests a really long right tail when in your percentage distribution, which is kind of what made me think that perhaps you're not looking at the right sample. because if you really do want to look at just elites, you want to. I think your average versus your median is you want it to be closer in matching, just to make sure that you have kind of an even distribution. Otherwise, you're going to be comparing people with, I don't know, like 2,000 followers versus 20,000, and that means something very different qualitatively.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly, it's a social network, so there's certainly, it's a power law distribution, and I haven't matched that to the percentile rank, but you're right, I should look at that in more detail.
All right, great. I just want to jump in on this elites definition and then get Chris on a one finger. And if I remember correctly, and I may not, but I think this is the way you define it is actually quite similar to the way that people like David Siegel and social networking people define elites. Mm-hmm. And so it seemed to me that, except that that's true, you want to emphasize that.
Yeah, the one advantage they have is they can incorporate structural measures of elites as well. Given all sorts of data restrictions, I can only use node level measurements, and so it's possible that someone who has a lot of followers is in a very closed community or is followed by a lot of bots, and I just don't know that. So the measures that you see in Seago are a step or two more advanced than the level of influence that I have here, the measure of influence that I have here.
Right. Laura, that's a two-figure.
Unmuted. Can you hear me? Yeah, so just sort of speaking about bots, one other concern about the Twitter data that I haven't heard discussed so far is that Twitter lends itself really easily to astroturfing, where you'll have elites who will actually form accounts that look like non-elite accounts in order to push out data, and they can do that or push out.
Uh-oh.
Sorry about that. Laura's joining us from a cafe, I think in Bogota, but somewhere in Colombia, and she just popped out. So hopefully we get her back and we get to find out what she had to say. But let's kick it to Chris.
All right, everyone can hear me okay? All right. So anyway, this is a very interesting paper. You know, I agree with the initial comment that papers like this are going to push the field forward. So this is great to see this tool. I echo some of the other. I want to echo some of the other the reservations that people had, and then also like add a little bit more detail. So, and one thing that sort of rises above a lot of these comments is I think this general point about showing that elites don't organize very well in this data, and the non-elites do all the organization, and using this as a test of this theory, I think it oversells probably what you're doing. You don't need to oversell it. I think if you try to oversell it in that fashion, the referees are going to come back on you hard. So modesty is a virtue in a lot of these things, and so if you err on the side of being modest about what you're doing, but then actually do some very interesting stuff, and if you're very clear about the weaknesses in the intro, briefly, and then throughout, I think it's going to strengthen the credibility and enhance the reaction to this. So I would encourage you to reconsider the overall framing. Why is that? So a few people have mentioned that they're not sure that this is actually really a test of the role of elites in mobilizing. What does an elite look like? When someone reads that introduction, when someone's thinking about this theory, what do they think about an elite? Well, they don't. They're probably thinking about someone who's been doing some kind of political organization for a year, or 5 years, or 20 years. Maybe has a lot of gray hair. Maybe has never heard of Twitter. May do a lot of offline social organizing that then their non-elite sycophants or the non-elite members of their network or their group then tweet and encourage. Or they may get the protests moving, or they may get some of these events moving, and then people jump on with some social media expertise and make this happen, and it may happen in a very sort of crowd, bottom-up kind of way, but in fact the protests were not. So I don't think you want to overstate. You in some sense you don't have the data to say. If you wanted to make this a little bit more convincing, if you were to take a country, I imagine lots of ways in which you can validate your data, right? A lot of people are going to have questions about, is this data doing X? And I think the way to answer that is to pick some of those strategically and see to what extent you can validate them. So maybe you could, who are the 50 protest organizing elites in Egypt, or even the pick if there were lists of these people, it doesn't have to be a formal list. It just has to be maybe people who are quoted or mentioned in major news sources, major people who are arrested, who knows what. You can then look to see whether or not they're even on Twitter and whether or not they used hashtags, right? You have all these selection mechanisms into whether or not they're, one, observed in your data, and two, coded as elites. And so if you could actually show that actually these people who we do think of as traditional elites who are doing the organizing are actually represented, and they're trying to get their hashtags out there and they're not very good at it, or no one picks them up, and it's actually this crowdsourced, then I think that's going to be a little bit more credible. You still don't convince us that they're not doing all of these offline things, or these things on Facebook, or these things on the telephone that aren't leading to a lot of mobilization, but I think you've gotten us a little further. I have some other comments, but I'll just sort of try to stick to a single theme at once.
Hey, Zach?
Yeah, great. Thanks a lot, Chris. I certainly need to work on my tone. That's part of my growing experience in the last year, as well as the particular framing of the paper. So I agree with that. That's still part of working through this before I'm ready to send it out. In terms of validation, it's actually great that you said what you said, because that's my next dissertation chapter. And so maybe the discussion needs to be how to bring some of that evidence into this paper, but I do in the next dissertation chapter, do a much more fine-grained analysis of 21 activists who self-identify as protest organizers in Bahrain and Egypt, and I've purchased all of their tweets and then combined that with other ethnographic reports of what they were doing at the time to connect their online behavior to offline behavior. And frankly, it seems like there is a disconnect between how they're using Twitter and then how Egyptians and Bahrainis are using Twitter. They're using different hashtags. They're using them at different frequencies. The elites are not using it to organize. So I've done that, and maybe I need to bring some of that discussion into this paper, is what I'm hearing.
Okay, great. Laura, unfortunately you dropped on us. But...
Yeah, let's try this again. So I just had one other concern about the Twitter data. I share a lot of the concerns that have been brought up. But another thing is that Twitter lends itself really easily to astroturfing, where elites will form accounts that look like non-elite accounts in order to broadcast their message. And they can do this because they're worried about being targeted, which has already been brought up. They can also do it because it's just a way to make your message look much broader than it is and make it look like a groundswell. And you'd mentioned bots and said you really have no way of knowing if somebody's being followed by a lot of bots. And I actually don't think that's totally true. The University of Indiana Complex Systems program has a simple JavaScript program that actually sort of assesses, they call it truthiness, but they're looking for astroturf, in particular Twitter memes. And all it really does is form an index of how many tweets an account pushes out per day, the proportion of a hashtag that an account is responsible for, and so on. And you can develop a sort of measure to see if something looks like a natural user or looks like a bot. And I'd be interested both in terms of who's following your so-called elites and also who your so-called elites are. Are they actually people who are who your so-called non-elites are. So are they actually people who are elites who form these sort of ghost accounts in order to either protect their identities or make their movement look broader than it is? And I think that sort of gets to some of these broader philosophical and theoretical issues about what an elite really is in your Twitter network, and it's also sort of a methodological easy fix. And then another methodological easy fix on the Twitter data side is I would be interested in seeing a robustness check that does a very simple content analysis of your tweets and a very simple content analysis of your dependent variable articles, and just look for similarity in content. And you can, and there might be sort of an interesting temporal element to that as well. Are we seeing language about protests being discussed that actually looks like protests that happen later, according to the news media? And it might be a way to sort of assuage some of the concerns that Yuri brought up also about the reverse temporal problem, where people are just tweeting about things that already happened.
Great, those are all really good points. Indiana University does great work. I haven't looked at their particular JavaScript. I'm not particularly concerned about astroturfing in these examples because in these countries, because astroturfing tends to be related to a new particularist policy that is trying to appear to have a groundswell of support. Whereas across my sample, these are widespread general events that a wide range of people are latching onto. So while there certainly are going to be bots who engage in spam production activity, which I'll talk about in a second, they're not driving the Jan 25 hashtag or the Feb 20 or the Feb 14. They are picking up on the use of that hashtag, but they're not astroturfing it. And that's one of the strengths of my Gini measure is that it's going to pick up and I show in one of the sections that the hashtags that it picks up on each day as being the most popular hashtag are these generalist, broad hashtags, not more particular ones that would be associated with astroturfing. I did also at one point manually identify spam simply as being tweets with 3 or more hashtags and a link. I got that formula from this James Kwok 2009 paper, which that's what they used to identify spam. And I didn't find an effect for spam. I didn't find a correlation for spam, and I didn't, including spam, didn't change any of the main results. And to be honest, your last comment, you were breaking up. I think your point was about comparing the tweets about protests to the news articles about protests. Is that right? Okay, so go ahead.
Yeah, I was just suggesting doing a sort of simple content analysis on your explanatory and dependent variables.
Mm-hmm. So one of the problems with GDELT, and I should talk more about GDELT later because Yuri brought it up as well, is that at this time period that the data come from, they did not provide links to the original sources. They do now, but not for 2011. So I can't actually go back and look at the particular news article that the event is based on. Looking at the tweets, though, they certainly are. Most of them are about protests. There is noise. There are, I pick up some noise, but it's people saying I'm going down to Tahrir at this time, or which hashtag do we use, or they're using tear gas. I mean, the tweets that use hashtag Jan25 or hashtag Tahrir are very specific about protests. And she's gone.
Okay, great. Thomas.
Yeah, so I guess sort of echoing something that Laura said. So one thing that I know from, I've talked to Dean Freelon and some of the other people who do a lot of this stuff on in Arabic, and it's a pain in the butt. They were saying because a lot of the text is non-standard, right? So a lot of it is, English, text, and as you were saying, is that, Twitter didn't allow Arabic text for a while. So one is, how are you getting around this? Because they've said that, they've just had a pain in the butt, trying to get at all the slang, all the fact that there's kind of non-standard characters. And I know you've used, I think it's Alex Hanna's, one of the things that he's done. So I wonder about that. And then the second thing is, and I think this is kind of a big, again, a bigger theoretical question, is it seems like you're kind of smushing, all of the differences. There are wide differences of how social media, and especially Twitter, is used across these 16 countries, right? And you're kind of smushing it down to just sort of followers. And, one of the biggest things we know from, my work, I've known Dean's work and other people, is that these networks look very, very, very different, right? In terms of who's on Twitter, who's actually tweeting. and just like raw numbers of how people are tweeting. So I wonder, right, if what we're at, what are we actually sort of picking up if, you're taking all this rich data about how these networks and then saying, well, it all follows the sort of same model in every country. And, I would encourage you to, kind of break it out, because I think that's, I think one, it'll be a bit more, I think you'll be on a bit more solid ground. And then you can also add, you're saying you're doing the ethnographic stuff, and I think that's great. But I think here, that's my biggest concern, is that you're masking a ton of heterogeneity within these countries, within the networks, within who's on Twitter, just by this kind of coordination and follower stuff.
Mm-hmm. Those are good points. So working with Arabic is annoying, and I profess to have zero expertise in that. I rely solely on Alex Hanna's lemmatization, or his stemming, and then lemmatization from Python's NLTK library. And that's after I've coded them. Initially, when I code the tweets, I didn't code the tweets. I worked with native Arabic-speaking undergraduates to read the tweets in Arabic and Bahrain to make the content model, and then I run the parser and et cetera, and build the SVM. To the extent that there's all this slang, et cetera, it adds a lot of noise, which is going to make it much more difficult to find any results. So that gives me a little more confidence if I do find something. In terms of the Gini measure and the tweets, what's interesting is that even though Twitter introduced an Arabic interface in March 2012, but a large percentage, almost a majority of the users were actually tweeting in Arabic at this time, yet they were still using English hashtags, which is a whole different phenomenon of interest. But the point is that the Gini measure still picks up this hashtag, and it's not going to you're not going to have 5 different hashtags which are very similar and mean the same thing but look different because it's in Arabic. They're generally English hashtags, and so for the Gini analysis, I don't have to worry about that. In terms of social media use varying across countries, you're absolutely right. I saw your article in JPR. That's an assumption I make that I have to use to do the analysis. And then there was one other comment. Oh, so the best attempt at working with that is removing certain countries from the analysis at different stages of the robustness check, and that that means I remove them not specifically for the reasons that you suggest, but if Twitter is used differently there, then removing them is also going to take care of that.
Okay, Yuri on a 2-finger, and then Vera, I've put you in a 1-finger.
Yeah. So on the Arabic issue, I was wondering, have you tried running this stuff through Google Translate API, coding them manually, coding a training set manually for the SVM, or for any other purpose? Because I've been doing similar work with other languages, not Arabic. Where we've actually done a comparison in the original source language and in the machine translated English. The thing about SVM, right, it's a bag of words model, right? So it discards word order, and for things as short as Twitter, where you're basically trying to pick up topics, it may not be. It doesn't really violate any assumptions to go that way. I mean, where it might be a problem is where we have informal language and slang. But beyond that, I think the results that we've had, and we've run multiple classification algorithms on the multiple languages. If you just look at the term frequencies of the coded text, they're almost completely they're correlated at like 0.8 in terms of which documents are classified into which category. Completely different coders, and this basically translating the raw text. And then stemming and stop word removal and all that. I'm just wondering if you tried that.
So there were 2 questions. If I've used Google Translate, then have I tried other models? Is that right? So I originally did start with Google Translate, and that is why I went to using native Arabic speakers. Google Translate actually works pretty well on the activists whose tweets I purchased. So the 21 people I alluded to earlier. These are people like from the human rights community in Bahrain or the no military trials movement in Egypt. who are both working for an international audience and are educated, and also tweeting in Arabic sometimes. Google Translate handles their tweets very well. Google Translate knows what to do with that. It's when I then randomly select tweets from the stream that Google Translate usually has a lot of problems, because then you're getting a lot of slang and local dialect. And so I would not use Google Translate in every situation. It depends on the research question. I used you're right. It's a bag of words model. So I've also used naive Bayes classifier, and it's slightly less good, but not hugely different. I think actually the short form of Twitter is one of the advantages for content analysis, because you can use a bag of words model, because there's not much subtlety in meaning. Largely pick up what's going on. I haven't done the as extensive verification checks as it sounds like you've done, but it's there.
Okay, Vera.
Hello. I have a couple of comments. One about elites. So I was wondering, I saw that you measured elites by number of people who are subscribed to read them, but is it just in the beginning of protest or during, like how number of people subscribed increase for some activists?
Mm-hmm.
Because, you know, some of them, I work with activists on the ground in Syria, and, you know, some of them became activists in the middle of the protest. So
Mm-hmm.
then, like, with one tweet, it got retweeted, and in a day they get increase, like, really incredible increase in number of followers.
Mm-hmm.
So I was wondering about that. So they're not political elites, just they were in the right place and right time, so they did one tweet, and then everyone started following them.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So then my question is, talking about like Facebook, and that a lot of activists were organizing people on Facebook. Could you control for that somehow? Looking on links to Facebook posts, if it's possible, if Twitter allows links to Facebook. Does it?
So it does. I've only looked to see if there's a link, and then not where the link goes. It would be hard to know where the link goes, because most people use URL shorteners, which are going to get rid of the facebook.com part of the link.
Mm-hmm.
But I could look for that. I haven't tried actually reading the link to get a sense of what it's linking to.
Because if something was organized on Facebook, by someone was going to pick it up by just putting a link on Twitter.
Yeah.
And then just a minor question. I was looking into this Twitter thing for Russia, and Russian government is employing pro-government bloggers and pro-government Twitter people. It was not the case, right, in Arab Spring. Like, the government did not have any their trolls.
In most countries that's right. Bahrain was actually very very good at. So both their authentic pro-government Twitter users in Bahrain, as well as pro-government government-run accounts and government trolls. That I think there was some of that in Syria as well, but otherwise that wasn't a common regime tactic during the Arab Spring.
Do you somehow distinguish tweets by those guys and by normal people? Because they're gonna both, I guess, use the hashtag Tahrir, for example, but have different, say different things.
I do not. I do not in the main measure. To create the support vector machine, I did distinguish between pro-government tweets versus pro-protest tweets. And so if I'm one of these accounts and I use hashtag Tahrir or hashtag Lulu, and then use that to disparage the protests, I would pick up on it in the support vector machine, but not in the Gini measure.
I see. And just two more small comments. I was afraid because not a lot of reporters were there in the beginning. A lot of reporters from outside media were relying on tweets themselves, right? Mm-hmm. To report, because they did not get there. So could you control? So it could be a really correlation, like number of tweets and news report about that. So could you look at the relation between Arab language tweets and English language tweets about the same issue, like kind of to see what reporters are picking up from tweeters, because English language tweets are going to be for foreign reporters.
Mm-hmm. I've thought about that. I think that would be. I would love to know how the Arabic and English language tweets differ, because they certainly do. And I feel like I've read some work that's done that, and I can't tell you what they find right now. But I have not specifically done that. The closest I get is in one of my robustness checks. I use only tweets in Arabic, under the assumption that these are the ones that are less likely to be from international journalists or trying to get journalists' attention. But I haven't actually compared the Arab tweets to the Arabic tweets to the English tweets.
I see. And just one very last comment that I'm sure not the case, but maybe for people who study like Russian protest right now, it could be an issue that people who self-report locations on Twitter, on Facebook, I know, like, for example, a lot of activists from Russia, a lot of activists from Ukraine and so on, when they're even based in the United States, they still put location in Russia and Ukraine, just to make a point that they are affiliated with this country, although they're diaspora.
Mm-hmm.
And those are, they're tweeting the most because they're sitting here in a safe place. So I was wondering, I'm sure it's kind of not the case, but just if you could make, just some footnote about that. So
yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
Thanks.
So you asked about the number of followers. That's a really great question. To construct the follower measure, I actually do use a cross section. So I say, God, is it? I have to go back and look at my code. I believe it's for the month of December 2011. It's at some point at the end of my sample is when I look at the distribution of followers. Or no, actually, sorry, it's just a cross section. It's across the whole sample. I look at the distribution of followers, and then I construct the measure from that, so that if you were not popular, through January 2011 and then gained a bunch of followers starting in February, you would. My measure counts you as popular in January and December. I have thought about making that a more dynamic measure of influence, right? So even maybe like on every day who's the most influential person, every week, every month, you start running into issues of not having enough data at a daily or weekly level for a lot of the countries. And so, but to be honest, I've really struggled with what point in time to use the measurement to construct the elite measure. But right now, I'm agnostic to time when I construct it.
Okay. Yuri had to take off, and I think Vera needs to leave in a few minutes. I wanted to follow up, Zach, on this, on the question of agent provocateurs and trolls and all of that, and I was also thinking about the Russian case that I've been reading about recently. And to the extent that I think it's really interesting that you have some information that the Bahraini government was on top of this in a way that the other states apparently weren't. And so I'd encourage you to think a little bit about how time-bound this is. To what extent do your results really generalize only to situations in which states are being naive? And so I think it's really interesting that you've got at least one case where states aren't being naive, because I think that's an advantage. If you can show that that state efforts don't change your results, then there isn't any concern about time bound. And so trying to leverage the Bahrain versus versus not Bahrain might be useful in that regard.
Thanks.
All right, I have another a one finger that I'll throw out there, and it's the state, and it dovetails off what we were just saying. The state doesn't show up, and it seems to me conceivable that what the state did yesterday, in terms of its coercive behavior, has an impact on what on the tweeting activity tomorrow. And so you can measure state coercive behavior, right? GDELT can report on that, and it seems to me that that would be something that you would want to include in your models. Is that something you just haven't thought about, or is there a case to be made that no, you thought about it and the state's excluded for a reason?
I've thought about it. The main reason I have excluded the state is but I think that most of that variation is going to be captured by the lag-dependent variable and country fixed effects. But otherwise I just haven't gone back to pull the repressive measures from GDELT. But I should. But are you suggesting like it sounded like you were suggesting a two-level model to predict the number of tweets based on state behavior?
No, I'm actually thinking that that what the state does is going to affect the level of coordination, right? I mean, what does the state want to do? It wants to destroy coordination. It wants to atomize this movement. Mm-hmm. And one thing we know the states are doing is they're either succeeding or failing. They're using coercion or using cash machines or whatever sorts of tactics that they're using. They're very heavily involved in this. I mean, they're extremely invested in taking actions to try to demobilize. Yeah. And your model effectively says, well, that doesn't matter. And so I would encourage you to have, to include some measure. Yeah, ideally, yeah, should we all be modeling with multiple actors? And sure, yes, we should. But the tradition for a long time has been not to, because it's super complicated. And yeah, okay, a lag-dependent variable has, right, you're soaking up a lot of variation, and that should certainly capture some of it, but I find it more satisfying to see an actual measure of state behavior in there and show that even, because I'd be stunned if it has no effect, mm-hmm. And then show that you're still finding your results in the presence of a control for that.
Yeah, I'll do that in the next iteration.
Okay, we have an open queue, and I think, Chris, you had said you had a few other things, and sorry, we've also got Carrie. So, Carrie, you want to go first?
Okay. I had 2 points. We've talked a lot about the data and kind of research methodology. I had one question on that, and then I kind of want to go back to theory and discuss some of the theoretical and causation, which was brought up earlier. The first question I had was your N and kind of your unit of analysis. So the unit of analysis is the country day, correct? Mm-hmm. So I mean, really rough look at that. It looks like it's an average of something like 425 days over 16 countries. I wonder how much variation is there in that, and when do you start your count versus when do you end it? So are we looking at the exact same time period for every country? Are we looking at 600 days for Egypt and 12 days for Morocco? Like how am I conceptualizing your unit of analysis here?
Okay. So yeah, every country is in there for 426 days, starting on November 1st, 2010, and ending December 31st, 2011. I chose November because the first Arab Spring protests started in mid-December in Tunisia in 2010, and so I figured November 1st just gave me enough time to have a baseline. And then I end at the end of December because the end of December 2011 because the tweets coming from the team at Northeastern stopped at the end of 2011. And so those were the bookends. But otherwise, it's a balanced panel. I have each country in there for 426 days.
Okay. So knowing that now, I I think you may have some problems just with kind of diffusion effects here, because the Arab Spring, as we know, kind of starts in Tunisia on December 14th with a huge event, right? Like there was no protest, there was no plan to protest leading up to December 14th and the self-immolation. I mean, it was just you had these people on the ground who were dormant until you had a Timur Quran-like preference revelation. And then all of a sudden you got very fast tipping points. So I would urge you to think more carefully or think a little deeper about why you're starting at November 1st when we know that those 6 weeks are going to be very, very quiet leading up to December, and then it only spreads throughout the Arab world, kind of country by country. But particularly those 6 weeks leading up, I would urge you to think a little bit and find a theoretical justification for why you need those 6 weeks. Okay. The second, okay, so moving on to kind of theory, I guess this dovetails, going into kind of causation and thinking about causation. My understanding of Timur Quran, which you lay out quite well in kind of your intro and lit review, but my understanding is that it's all about revealing preferences and tipping points. And so it's been a while since I've read his paper, but once elites get to that tipping point, though, then you do expect the masses to take over. And so I wonder if you do see if there's a difference between what elite activity is doing up until kind of your 10-day, like day 10 of protests, until you reach that tipping point versus what happens after that tipping point. If there's some kind of different distribution in the kind of pre and post area when all of a sudden you've got this enormous amount of kind of hashtagging that goes on. Mm-hmm. That would be theoretically really interesting to me, and I think would go a much longer way towards dispelling or or at least being more. It would give you much more credibility in how you're looking at these, how you're juxtaposing kind of elites versus masses in protest. Is that something you might be able to do?
Yeah, I've thought about that. That it's right there. There's kind of a handoff once the tipping point takes over, and so in most days it is. In most days, elites are not coordinated, and that's why I have this finding. To be honest, the best research design I can think of for that would be to just subset each country's days to be a few days before the start of their first major protest and then a few days after. And I haven't pursued that just because I've been working a lot to get it to where you see it now, and I'm not convinced that's the best research design. But I agree that what you described could be what's happening. I think I want a better way to tackle it before I start tackling it. I'm open to anyone's suggestions.
Why don't we poll the audience?
Yeah.
How many people would like to see that research design? Just raise your hand if you think the research design he just described would be really compelling. All right, so you're getting some support.
Okay.
Carrie, did you have more?
I just had a thought on the. I guess my last thought on this is thinking about the mechanisms behind how hashtagging is affecting coordination. I found myself wondering. You go into kind of the logistics of how hashtagging works, but I wonder if you might not be able to think about or perhaps tell a story about why the Arab Spring is different and why Twitter is different, in that ICTs and social media kind of replace elites by making it much easier to reveal your preferences. This might be a story that you could toy with, and so, why am I looking at Twitter? Why am I looking at Facebook? Why do I think this is important? And what might be able to replace this body of literature? Like, we live in a brand new world now, where social media can, replaces the need for ingrained political elites that we have traditionally thought were important.
Yeah, I go back and forth on how much I'm engaging in the ICT social media debate. You know, I really want to make the argument that Twitter is a window into protest space. This is what like Segerberg and Bennett argue. But then, as Thomas pointed out, when you have 0.03% penetration of Twitter, it's a very particular kind of window. And I don't want to engage in the what does social media let you do debate in this paper. But then you're suggesting that I have to understand exactly what I'm measuring. And so I don't know. That's a fair point.
Yeah, I just want to push back. Keep in mind that the 0.03% is the entire population. Nowhere near, you know, what was the percentage that actually turned out in the protests? I'd be surprised if it was 5%, right? So that, and yet probably the users are much more likely to protest. So the penetration is not as horrible as it sounds. But if you could actually get real information on that, that would have some value. Both Thomas and Laura on two fingers. So Thomas.
Well, I mean, I'll respectfully disagree with you, Will. I think the problem is, right, I mean, so your argument, Zach, and I think, I mean, it's tough because I sympathize in some sense, right, is there's you don't want to get down the counterfactual without the, you know, social media, we wouldn't observe, you know, the protests, right? But I think that's what a lot of us kind of are reading into it a little bit. You know, the counterfactual is, you know, without this, you know, this Twitter, you know, is, you know, boosting the protest, right? And I think you want to be, you know, in the way that I hear you describe it now, I'm like, okay, basically what he's saying is this is a proxy for some kind of, you know, coordination activity. And I think, you know, and this goes back to Chris on the framing of this, is you want to be very, you know, clear that that's kind of what's the argument that's going on. Because I think, you know, I read it and the counterfactual was, you know, in the absence of people tweeting about this, we're not seeing a ton of protests. And I think that's also what, you know, some of the arguments, especially when you start talking about sort of this is not an elite phenomena, right? Then it's the social media revolution. And this was already kind of what people have talked about, you know, the revolution will be tweeted. The second thing that I wonder too, and, you know, you were talking a little bit about the G-Delt, right, and saying how you have the lag in there, right? So you have the 1 day lag as most of your models. There's the 3 day lag in a few of them. But I wonder, right, so to G-Delt, right, you know, how good is G-Delt at picking up the exact day of the reporting, right? I mean, and that's where, you know, I'd be curious to know, right, because you have a tight window in there, right? I mean, you're talking about 1 day and then the next day, and so a lot of these protests may be bleeding over back and forth. So I wonder, right, is sort of how sensitive that is, and then I think coming back, you know, just, you know, I know you have the 3 day lag in there, but I just, you know, would like to get a sense of basically how accurate is G-Delt at like saying this is when the protest happened, because you have super accurate data on the Twitter side, right? The Twitter side, you know, we know the timestamp, et cetera, but it's the G-Delt data that's a little fuzzier.
Yeah.
And you have that, and as you said, and I think one of the big things that you have now that's good is the IQs data, which, you know, we're a lot more comfortable with. So you're, you know, that's much better. The second thing is to echo Will's point. I think, you know, while the government reaction, right, you know, that may be almost a whole nother paper, but it can also at least illuminate to you, you know, if the government is not responding on Twitter, I tend to think that at least in some sense, you know, they're somewhat strategic actors, right? That can let you know, and maybe can even give you a signal. The government is actually thinking this is going on, right? Whether it is or not, right? I mean, so, you know, there are a lot of things maybe to critique, you know, about, you know, some of these arguments, but, you know, Navid Hassanpour's paper on turning off the internet, right? If they believe this is going on, right, and they believe this coordination story, because this was out there, right, then we should see some kind of governmental response, right, related to social media, and that might even get, you know, strengthen your argument, right? Because if they're, if they're just letting people, communicate, maybe they don't have the power, but a lot of, research would suggest, that, hey, they do have some ability to influence what goes on in social media, and that can give you sort of to say, hey, look, they're influencing what's going on in social media. This actually matters to the government, the people who are making decisions. And I think that can sort of strengthen your case that social media, in this sense, is proxying for something important. It may also be actually causing it. So that would be my suggestion.
I like that. That's a good point. So yeah, let's talk about GDELT. GDELT is essentially Tabari, which is Phil Sherrod's old program, and it does claim to pick up, I forget the fancy term, but words that will time shift, that it has time shifting enabled, so that if yesterday or tomorrow is an article, it knows that it's not talking about an event today. I haven't tried to ground truth that in any sort of way, except by comparing it to SCAD and ACLED. IQs just came available like in the last week, and so I now want to play with IQs. That just wasn't data that I had until a week ago. Mike Ward has compared GDELT to IQs in like a long blog post working paper sort of thing. And there are high levels of coordination, and IQs is certainly better. So I will get on that. Yeah, IQs might be the main data source. It might just be a verification. We'll have to see how far back it goes.
Okay, Laura?
Actually, just go about 5 minutes, and Laura does as well.
Oh, okay, yeah, Chris. Sorry.
No, we have our comparative seminar. Just starting in about 10 minutes. I'll throw into that as well. My instinct, well, just to pick up on a couple things that have been said, my instinct is I think it's hard for me to imagine a situation where you wouldn't have to go for IQs. I think GDELT seems to have a lot of, I mean, this is just for me from the periphery being a little bit familiar with these data sets, but not deeply familiar. I think IQ seems to have a lot and a growing amount of credibility, and GDELT has a lot of uncertainty around it and low credibility. You may want to, whichever route you go, you don't really have any discussion of the completeness of the class. It's kind of really common in papers. It's kind of drives you crazy. People sort of assume that that's either understood because it's elsewhere. You have to not only describe it in detail, but describe how that affects your identification you're running. Your story. And engage with that in a few paragraphs. Maybe it will lead to some appendix analysis. The one.
Chris?
Yes.
We've you sound like the characters in the Peanuts, the adults, the want.
Really?
Yeah. Well, this sounds better.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Can anyone else hear Chris well?
No. Weird.
Now I can hear you.
Now you can hear me? Okay. So, all right. So stop me if I start to sound strange again. What I worried about was with your empirical strategy with the one lag is you don't really talk about like the time relationships. I was trying to imagine a situation, and I didn't have time to really look closely and dwell on it, but I thought, what if an elite at T-3 started a hashtag, and at T-2 and T-1 it got picked up by the masses, and then you ran your regression, you would say, oh, these elites don't matter, because yesterday's elite hashtags didn't get picked up by the masses right away. So I wonder if you're sort of inherently biased. I mean, I don't know with what. And I think you said something about, oh, these hashtags tend to go away quickly, but I'm not sure that's true. So I suppose, I suppose looking at like actually analyzing the lifespan of these hashtags and convincing us that you have the right time dependence in the model is going to be really crucial. But basically, the whole paper is built around that one estimate, and I just didn't see why I should believe this one as being as sort of telling us the full story about what you want to tell us, and really encapsulating how influential these are, if they are indeed.
And you've gone wonky on us, but I think the main point got across. Zach, do you have a response?
Not a great one. First, I agree about IQs, so I will get started on that ASAP. Yeah, the lifetime of a hashtag and trying to capture this snowball process. Yeah, no, I mean I've thought about it. I feel like it would be a separate paper. What I've done so far to convince you that this hashtag use is capturing at least coordination is later on in the report, where I show the specific hashtags that were used each day and how that correlates with subsequent protests, and then just frankly pull out some tweets with different hashtags that show how they're being used. But that only captures the coordination part, not the elite coordination part. Short of going into a more focused case study, I can't think of a quantitative way right now of doing that, at least in the framework of this paper.
Chris, let's see if we can get a clean mic on you.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, I'd have to think about it. I'm not much of a. I don't think a lot about time series analysis. I suppose basically just looking at additional lags, or maybe looking at longer lag periods, like an average of T-1 to T-5. Yeah, and also, yeah, I wonder if you can look at like effects. I think you could, but I don't think it's a separate paper. You have to tackle it here. I think it's your identification strategy. It's all I guess.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've.
I will send you.
All right, great.
Okay.
Thank you, Chris. Laura.
Okay, this is just sort of dovetailing off of some of these comments about the temporal element of all of this, and I think that you use the phrase a couple of times in the paper that is spontaneous and diffuse. And I don't think that you can make either of those claims with the research strategy that you have now. And some of that has already sort of been discussed with the spontaneity and what we saw in Bahrain versus what we saw in Egypt, and you're looking at very different phenomena, and I think that you should certainly take to heart Chris and Carrie's comments about looking at time a little bit more in a more sophisticated way. In terms of diffusion, I think you could make that claim with readily available empirical strategies. I just think you're not. And I think that one thing you could do is sort of take the universe of tweets that you're looking at in each country, and maybe this is a case study, and do a network analysis and see, are a lot of these tweets sort of coming from closely connected individuals, or are they in fact coming from what appear to be very disparate individuals who aren't following one another? And that'll sort of get at some of these issues about the life of the hashtag. If you do a dynamic network analysis, it'll also sort of assuage some of the concerns, I think, about who an elite really is and where these hashtags are actually coming from.
Okay. Yeah, spontaneous and diffuse, I need better vocabulary. I wanted, frankly, a kind of sexy way of saying not elite, because repeating non-elite over and over would just get really boring. And this goes back to Chris's comment about being more modest and not overselling, because you're right. I don't test it. I don't think so. Doing a network analysis in country is unfortunately not very easy, given Twitter rate limits and the fact that the Arab Spring is now 3 months old. We could talk about that later, but the only way you could do a network analysis would be to have the links be like retweets or user mentions, which is different than the actual following or follower network, which I think is the real quantity of interest to a lot of us.
I'm trying to think of just a pursue Chris's line of thought a little bit more. It seemed to me what he was interested in is the life cycle of a hashtag, and that does seem like something that you could evaluate, especially particularly since you already have kind of the top hashtags in each country, and I would imagine that they persist over time. They're certainly not going to disappear in 24 hours, right? And so I'm wondering if there would be value. I'm thinking on the fly here, so highly risky. But I'm wondering if there would be value in trying to identify who the first people were who, and obviously not for everything, right? Not for all 16 countries, but as another analysis to actually look at some of these, tweets that played a major role around the times of, major mobilizations like January 25th or what have you, and see whether or not there were elites that started it, but it didn't really pick up until later.
Mm-hmm. Am I muted?
Nope.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, I've thought about that, just kind of putting all the tweets in a data frame and find the first time that a tweet contains hashtag Jan25 or hashtag Feb14. I just haven't yet, frankly. Figure 7, though, I do look at the 4 most common hashtags in each country, and then, they're not always the most common, and so you can kind of see the rise and fall, and some of them persist and some of them don't, but that doesn't get to the diffusion and elite dynamic that Chris was talking about. The ones that don't persist tend to are prevalent at very specific times, obviously, at times that make sense, that correspond to real offline events.
Right.
But that doesn't get us back to the elite question.
Okay. And I wonder if I'm thinking about you've got this one paper, and then you've got this larger project, and a number of things have been raised about, well, we'd like to see, and some of which you've been like, oh, great, doing that in a different chapter, and others you're thinking, oh, boy, that sounds like an additional study, etc. Do you, obviously you want to get an article out, right? Mm-hmm. And are you thinking about this as the first article out of the dissertation project? Is that?
That's right, yeah.
It is? Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know that I have a concrete suggestion on that. But as you think about these comments and look back over this, this on YouTube, you'll want to try to give some consideration to what do I need to have in this paper, what can I reference in online appendix or in the other working paper, etc. And that's a tough,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a tough issue that you want to try to get feedback on from people and try different things. I don't know if Carrie, you have. We've dwindled.
Yeah, it's just the 3 of us.
Down in numbers. I don't know if Carrie, if you have any thoughts on that particular issue.
Sorry, remind me. Oh, here's Laura back again. About which one? You seem like about
just about
getting.
How to think about. This is a paper he wants to
publish.
Get out as an article. Do you have any specific thoughts on what you would recommend in terms of strategies if it's part of this larger project and standard stuff that people writing dissertations worry about, right?
Right. I think that if I were to get this as a reviewer, and I guess this is probably the best advice that I could give, I I would want to see a lot more on the theory side. You've got a really impressive data set, and I think Yuri and I think Chris were right when they said that this is definitely kind of going to push the literature forward empirically. But theoretically, I think you still have some work to do on framing and what exactly causal claims you're making. And so, especially about the role of Twitter, given, I mean, I'm basically regurgitating and cherry picking the things that have been said before, but, given low penetration and it's unclear, and difficulties with the lag and understanding kind of exactly how these movements unfold in a particular context, you're going to have to compensate for your lack of depth with some really clear falsifiable hypotheses on the theoretical side, and say if this is going on, then I should expect this, and if it's not going on, then I should expect a result from something completely different. And I think that as far as getting something published and as far as reviewers would go, I think that would make things much clearer to be able to outline that, because right now we've done a lot on the data and methodology side and kind of picking apart, well, it would be better if you did this, it would be better if you did that. I think, the paper is that you have clearly thought a lot about the data and about the empirical side, but I think sharpening up the theoretical and the theoretical expectations would go a long way towards alleviating some of the concerns and the noise that you have in your data.
Great, thank you. Laura, we dropped you, and I was just raising the whole article, larger dissertation project. Zach would like to try to move this forward to a submission. Do you have any suggestions on that for this paper? And Laura seems frozen. I'm not actually sure she's... Okay. I don't know that she's here. All right. Zach, do you have any questions that you didn't get a chance to throw to Carrie and I?
No. Your last question about thinking about publication is what I wanted to get at. I see this is my most advanced chapter, and I think there are a few more weeks of focused work, and then I think I can send it off somewhere. So these are all really good comments, but I can't think of anything more specific.
Okay. And there's a chance that we have Laura back. Laura once, Laura twice.
I don't think so.
No.
Yeah. Oh, wait. Laura, are you there?
All right.
I can't tell. All right. Well, we'll put a wrap on this. Thanks, everybody, for joining in.
Thank you. I'm thrilled.
Particularly Carrie and Laura and everybody else who isn't here, because obviously if you guys didn't just volunteer your time, there's no compensation for this. So we very much appreciate pitching in, because otherwise the virtual workshop wouldn't happen. Please let others know about it. We put out our call for papers in December and August, which are terrible times to do it, but that's that is when we do it. So and we'd love to see some papers from y'all. So
all right, well, thank you.
Well, thanks for organizing. Thanks, Laura.
All
thanks,
right.
Carrie.
Bye.
Take care, everybody.
Bye.